The ocean roared with an unsettling intensity, waves crashing against the jagged cliffs of a forgotten shoreline. It was the kind of sound that carried stories, old tales of life beneath the surface, of mysteries no human had dared to explore. The horizon, veiled by a dense gray fog, seemed endless and menacing. A lone seagull cried out before vanishing into the mist, as if warning of what lay ahead. Captain Elena Marlowe tightened her grip on the helm of her weathered ship, the Mariner's Resolve. Her eyes, sharp as the horizon she constantly scanned, carried the burden of someone who'd seen too much. It wasn't just the salty breeze or the creaking of her vessel that weighed on her tonight. It was the whispers she'd heard in the harbors, the hushed warnings of an ocean that had become something more than a realm of water and waves. "They're moving closer," said Jonas, her first mate, his voice low but urgent. He stood near the railing, peering into the churning abyss. His rough hands, calloused from years at sea, trembled slightly as he clutched a weathered telescope. "I saw something big." Elena didn't respond immediately. She had heard the rumors too often to dismiss them outright. Sharks, massive and intelligent, ruling the waters as if the ocean were their kingdom. The stories varied depending on who told them. Some claimed these predators had evolved beyond comprehension, others whispered of human meddling gone horribly wrong. But one thing was consistent in every tale: the sharks weren't acting like animals anymore. "You think it's real?" Elena finally asked, her voice steady but laced with a quiet tension. Jonas hesitated, then nodded. "I've seen too much out here to call it a lie. Last month, the crew of the Sea Crow went missing. No wreckage, no survivors. Just blood in the water." Elena's jaw tightened. The Sea Crow had been helmed by her closest friend, Captain Harris, a man as seasoned and resilient as the ocean itself. His disappearance had sent shockwaves through the maritime community, but few dared to investigate. "We're not turning back," Elena said firmly, though the unease in her chest threatened to betray her confidence. "If these waters are as dangerous as they say, then someone has to figure out why." The crew worked silently, their faces pale under the dim light of a crescent moon. The fog thickened, swallowing the ship in an oppressive shroud. Every creak of the hull and splash of water felt amplified, as if the ocean itself were alive, watching, waiting. Then it happened. A loud guttural noise reverberated from beneath the ship, shaking it with a force that sent several crew members stumbling. Jonas dropped his telescope, his face a mask of terror. "Something's under us." Elena's heart raced. She darted to the edge of the deck, peering into the inky blackness. For a moment, there was nothing, just the rhythmic rise and fall of the waves. But then, a shadow emerged. It was massive, impossibly so, gliding just beneath the surface. The faint shimmer of moonlight caught the outline of a fin, taller than any she'd ever seen. The water seemed to ripple unnaturally around it, as if obeying the creature's command. "Everyone, hold your positions," Elena barked, trying to maintain control. But her voice wavered, and the crew knew it. The shadow circled the ship, its movements deliberate and hauntingly slow. A chilling realization settled over Elena. This wasn't a shark simply hunting. This was something different. This was a warning. And then, with terrifying speed, the creature breached the surface. The crew screamed as water cascaded over the deck. Elena's eyes widened, her breath caught in her throat. Before her stood a shark unlike any she had imagined. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its massive jaws bore scars that told stories of countless battles. It lingered for a moment, as if assessing them, before vanishing back into the depths. Jonas stumbled toward her, his voice barely audible. What are we dealing with?" Elena didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of the tales she had dismissed as sailors' lore. The sharks weren't just hunting. They were rising. Elena stood frozen, her pulse pounding in her ears. The sea around them had settled into an eerie calm, but the memory of that enormous shark lingered like a ghost in the mist. The deck was drenched, salt water pooling at their feet, and the crew remained silent, their eyes darting nervously to the dark water below. Jonas wiped his face with a shaking hand, his usual steady demeanor cracked wide open. "Elena, we need to get out of here," he muttered, his voice low but urgent. "That thing, it wasn't normal. It wasn't just a shark." Elena didn't respond right away. She turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the fog stretched endlessly. Something deep inside her told her that running wasn't an option. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't going to stop just because they left. She'd spent too many years sailing these waters to ignore the signs. There was a pattern to the ocean, a rhythm, one that was now completely off balance. "We keep moving," she said finally, her voice firm but careful. "We came out here for answers, and I'm not leaving without them." Jonas exhaled sharply, frustrated but resigned. "You're stubborn, Captain. Always have been." Elena offered a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's why you stuck around all these years." Jonas shook his head but said nothing more. The rest of the crew, though shaken, got back to their tasks. There wasn't much to say when the sea was involved. It demanded respect, no matter how terrifying it became. As the ship pressed forward through the mist, Elena found herself thinking back to the warnings she'd heard in port towns. Old fishermen, their faces lined with years of salt and sun, had whispered about strange sightings. Massive fins cutting through the water, ships vanishing without a trace, and an unshakable feeling of being watched whenever they ventured too far from shore. She'd brushed it off at first, chalking it up to the usual superstition that came with a life at sea. But now she wasn't so sure. Hours passed in uneasy silence, the ocean stretching out endlessly in all directions. The fog had thinned just enough to reveal the faint outline of something in the distance. Elena squinted, her heart skipping a beat. "There," she said, pointing toward the shadowy shape. "Land." Jonas stepped up beside her, his brow furrowing. "That island. It's not on the charts." Elena nodded, a strange mix of excitement and dread settling in her chest. "Let's take a closer look." As they approached, the island came into clearer view. It was rugged and overgrown, jagged cliffs rising from the water like the broken teeth of a long-forgotten beast. Thick jungle covered most of the land, dark and unwelcoming. The moment the anchor dropped, a strange stillness settled over them. No birds called from the trees, no waves crashed against the shore, just an oppressive silence that made Elena's skin crawl. "Stay alert," she said as they lowered the dinghy into the water. Jonas and a few crew members joined her, their oars cutting through the stillness as they rowed toward shore. As they neared the beach, the sense of unease deepened. Elena could see the remnants of something. Old wooden structures half buried in the sand, rusted metal scraps scattered across the rocks. They pulled the boat onto shore, the soft crunch of sand underfoot the only sound. Jonas knelt down, picking up a corroded piece of equipment. "Looks like someone's been here before, but not for a long time." Elena scanned the treeline, her instincts telling her they weren't alone. "Let's move carefully." As they ventured deeper into the island, the jungle closed in around them. Vines twisted like grasping fingers, and the thick canopy blocked out most of the light. Elena could hear her own breathing, feel the sweat trickling down her back. They found more evidence of past activity, abandoned crates, faded warning signs with lettering too worn to read. But it wasn't until they reached the edge of a small clearing that they saw something that made their blood run cold. A massive skeleton, half buried in the earth. Jonas took a cautious step forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. "It's a shark," he murmured. "But it's huge." Elena crouched beside the bones, running her fingers over the jagged edges. They were thick, reinforced, as if the creature had evolved into something beyond what nature intended. She swallowed hard. "This isn't normal," she said quietly. Before Jonas could respond, a rustling sound came from the jungle. Every head snapped toward the noise, hands instinctively reaching for whatever weapons they carried. "Did you hear that?" one of the crew whispered. Elena stood slowly, motioning for silence. The rustling grew louder, closer. Then, without warning, something burst from the undergrowth. A man, disheveled and wild-eyed, his clothes tattered and stained with dirt. He stumbled toward them, eyes darting around in fear. "Who are you?" Elena demanded, stepping forward cautiously. The man gasped for breath, his voice hoarse. You shouldn't be here," he rasped. "They don't like it when people come here." Jonas narrowed his eyes. "Who? What are you talking about?" The man shook his head frantically, his hands trembling. "The sharks," he whispered. "They're not just sharks anymore." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. What happened here? The man's gaze flicked to the jungle behind him, his face pale. "They did experiments. They changed them. And now they're angry." A sudden, deep rumble echoed from the ocean beyond the trees, sending shivers through the ground beneath their feet. The man's eyes widened in terror. "They know you're here," he whispered. Elena's mind raced. If what he was saying was true, they were in far more danger than she had imagined. But before she could ask another question, a distant splash echoed from the shore. Loud, heavy, unnatural. Jonas grabbed Elena's arm. "We need to go. Now." Without another word, they turned and ran, the man following close behind. The jungle seemed to close in around them, branches snagging at their clothes as they pushed forward. Elena's heart pounded with every step, the feeling of being hunted growing stronger. When they finally reached the beach, their worst fears were confirmed. The dinghy was gone, the waves lapping at the empty shore. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she scanned the water, but she already knew the truth. The sharks weren't just in the ocean anymore. They were here, watching, waiting, and they had no way out. Elena stood frozen, staring at the empty shoreline where their dinghy should have been. The waves rolled in lazily, as if mocking them, carrying no sign of the small boat they had relied on to return to the ship. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but she forced herself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help them now. She turned to Jonas, whose face had gone pale under the dimming sky. "It's gone," he muttered, his hands clenching into fists. "They took it." Elena didn't argue. She knew what he meant by they. Whether it was the sharks or something worse, they were trapped. She shifted her gaze back toward the jungle, where the strange man stood, breathing heavily. His eyes darted around, his entire body tense with fear. "How did you get here?" Elena asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The man shook his head, his gaze locked on the dark water. "Doesn't matter," he said hoarsely. "No one leaves." Jonas stepped forward, his frustration boiling over. "That's not an answer, mate. What happened here? What are these things?" The man hesitated, running a trembling hand through his tangled hair. "It started with the labs," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Research stations. A few years back. They thought they could control them, make them smarter, stronger. But the ocean doesn't forgive. It doesn't forget." Elena felt a chill creep down her spine. She had heard of secret research operations hidden deep in the Pacific, but no one ever spoke about what went on inside them. If what he was saying was true, then this was far bigger than they had imagined. "You're saying they were experimenting on sharks?" she asked carefully. The man nodded. "Not just sharks," he muttered. "All kinds of things. They wanted control over the ocean. But they didn't realize," he trailed off, his eyes darting toward the water again, his breathing picking up. "They didn't realize the ocean would fight back." Elena exchanged a look with Jonas. She could see the fear in his eyes, but there was something else, too, determination. They weren't the type to run from danger, but right now, they needed answers, and they needed a way off this island. "We need to find shelter," Elena said finally, turning back toward the jungle. "And we need to figure out how to get back to the ship." Jonas hesitated, then nodded. "Agreed. But we stay close to the shoreline." I don't want to be too deep in that jungle without knowing what's out there. The man followed reluctantly, glancing back at the water one last time before trudging behind them. There's an old station, he said. Not far. But you won't like what's left of it. Elena led the way, moving carefully through the tangled undergrowth. Every step felt heavier, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her shoulders. The jungle was eerily silent, the only sounds coming from their own movements. Jonas kept his grip tight on the small knife strapped to his belt, his eyes scanning every shadow. After what felt like hours, they reached a clearing where rusted metal structures loomed in the fading light. The remains of what had once been a state-of-the-art facility now lay in ruin, walls covered in vines, broken glass littering the ground, and the faint smell of salt and decay lingering in the air. The man stopped at the edge of the clearing, his expression unreadable. This was one of the smaller labs, he said. They left in a hurry when things got bad. Elena stepped forward cautiously, pushing open a half-collapsed door. Inside, the remnants of the lab told a story of desperation. Papers scattered across the floor, shattered monitors blinking weakly, and strange tanks lining the walls, their glass cracked but still holding murky water. Jonas moved beside her, his face tense. What were they doing here? Elena reached down, picking up a file from the floor. The pages were water-damaged, but some of the writing was still legible. Cognitive Enhancement Trials, Phase 3, was scrawled across the top. Her stomach turned. They were trying to make them smarter, she whispered, flipping through the pages. Training them to communicate, to think. Jonas swore under his breath. And it worked, didn't it? Before Elena could respond, a sudden noise from deeper in the facility made them all freeze. A low, guttural sound, like a growl, but not quite. Something was moving in the shadows. Elena slowly reached for her flashlight, clicking it on and sweeping the beam across the ruined lab. The light caught movement, something large slithering past a row of broken tanks. Jonas stepped back instinctively, his grip tightening on his knife. "We're not alone," he muttered. Elena took a slow step forward, trying to get a better look. The light flickered across the floor, revealing deep gouges in the metal, claw marks, or something worse. "We need to go," the man whispered urgently. "Now!" Before Elena could respond, the sound of rushing water filled the air. A sudden, sharp impact hit the side of the building, shaking it to its core. Jonas grabbed her arm, pulling her back as the wall buckled slightly under the pressure of something massive outside. Elena's breath came in shallow gasps. She didn't know what was out there, but she knew one thing for sure: they were running out of time. "Back to the beach," she ordered. "Now!" The three of them ran, their footsteps pounding against the metal floor as another loud crash echoed through the building. They burst out into the open air, the jungle stretching before them like a dark maze. Jonas glanced back just in time to see a shadow moving along the shoreline, something sleek, powerful, and too fast for comfort. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the beach, their lungs burning. Elena doubled over, catching her breath, while Jonas scanned the horizon desperately for any sign of their ship. The man dropped to his knees, clutching his head. "You don't understand," he murmured. "They know we're here, and they don't let anyone leave." Elena straightened, swallowing hard. The ship was still anchored in the distance, but it might as well have been a world away. The water between them was no longer just an obstacle, it was a hunting ground. Jonas wiped sweat from his forehead, his expression grim. "So what now, Captain?" Elena squared her shoulders, forcing herself to think. "We find a way off this island, and we figure out how to stop whatever's happening here before it spreads." Jonas nodded slowly, but Elena could see the doubt in his eyes. The ocean stretched before them, dark and endless, and somewhere beneath the waves, the sharks were waiting. Watching. And she knew they wouldn't wait forever. Elena's mind raced as she stared out at the dark ocean, her pulse pounding in her ears. The ship was still there, a distant silhouette against the foggy horizon, but it might as well have been a dream. The water between them felt different now. Alive, unpredictable. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. Whatever was lurking beneath the surface wasn't just waiting. It was hunting. Jonas paced restlessly beside her, his eyes darting between the shoreline and the jungle behind them. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice edged with frustration. "We need a plan, Captain." Elena forced herself to take a deep breath. They were running out of time, and standing still wasn't an option. She turned to the man, who was still kneeling in the sand, his eyes fixed on the waves. "There's got to be another way off this island," she said. "You've survived this long how?" The man looked up at her, his expression hollow. "I hide," he said simply. "I stay out of the water. I stay out of sight." Jonas exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "That's not an option for us." He glanced toward the jungle. "What about inland? Any other boats? Radios?" The man hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There's an old comm station, up in the cliffs," he said. "It was abandoned when the facility shut down, but it might still work." Elena didn't waste another second. "Then we go," she said, her voice firm. "We get to that station and call for help." Jonas looked uneasy but nodded. "If it's still working." Elena met his gaze, her expression determined. "It's our best shot." The man stood shakily, his eyes scanning the water one last time before turning toward the dense jungle. "It's not far," he said. "But we have to move fast. They're always watching." Elena adjusted the strap on her backpack, her muscles tense as they stepped into the jungle. The thick foliage swallowed them up, the towering trees blocking out what little light remained. The path was narrow and overgrown, each step crunching against damp leaves and tangled roots. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air felt, thick with the scent of earth and decay. Jonas stayed close, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a branch sent his hand to his knife. Elena could feel the tension hanging heavy between them, and she knew they were all thinking the same thing. Whatever was out there might not just be in the water. The man led them uphill, his movements careful and practiced. "We're getting close," he whispered. "Just over that ridge." Elena pushed forward, her legs burning from the climb. But just as they reached the top of the ridge, she heard it, a low, guttural sound that sent ice through her veins. She froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the flare gun strapped to her side. Jonas turned, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Before anyone could answer, the underbrush exploded in a blur of motion. Something massive tore through the foliage, moving with a speed that shouldn't have been possible. Elena caught a flash of sleek, gray skin, rows of razor-sharp teeth glinting in the moonlight. "Run!" the man shouted, already sprinting down the slope. Elena didn't think, she just ran, her feet slipping on the damp earth as she tore through the jungle. Jonas was right beside her, his breath ragged, his eyes wide with fear. The creature crashed through the trees behind them, its heavy, wet breathing growing louder with every step. Branches whipped at Elena's face, but she didn't stop. The ground sloped downward, and suddenly they burst into another clearing, this one filled with rusted equipment and broken antennas jutting from the ground. "There!" The man pointed toward a small building half hidden by overgrown vines. Elena didn't hesitate. She threw herself against the door, shoving it open and tumbling inside. Jonas followed, slamming the door shut just as something heavy struck it from the outside. The whole structure shook, the metal groaning under the impact. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew. Elena scrambled to her feet, her flashlight sweeping across the room. Old equipment sat abandoned on rusted tables, wires hanging like vines from the ceiling. Jonas pressed his back against the door, his chest heaving. "That thing, it's still out there." Elena nodded, moving quickly to the control panel in the center of the room. The old radio equipment looked intact, but whether it still worked was another question entirely. She flipped a few switches, her heart hammering in her chest. The equipment sputtered to life, static crackling through the speakers. Jonas let out a breath of relief. "It's working." Elena nodded, adjusting the frequency. "I think so." The man hovered near the window, peeking through the cracked glass. "We don't have much time. They never give up." Elena ignored him, focusing on the radio. She pressed the transmitter button, her voice steady but urgent. "Mayday! Mayday! This is the Mariner's Resolve crew. We are stranded on an uncharted island and require immediate evacuation. Do you read me?" The radio crackled, static hissing through the speakers. Elena held her breath, waiting, hoping. Then, a faint voice cut through the static. "Copy. Who is this?" Elena's eyes widened. "This is Captain Elena Marlowe. We are stranded, and we are not alone. There's something here. Something in the water." More static. Then the voice returned, more urgent this time. "Get out. Dangerous. Not alone." The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Elena exchanged a glance with Jonas, her grip tightening on the radio. The man stepped away from the window, his face pale. "They're here." Before Elena could react, the entire building shook with another impact. The door buckled inward, and the low, guttural growl echoed through the walls. Jonas backed away, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're not just in the water anymore." Elena felt a chill settle in her bones. She knew they were running out of options. The sharks, or whatever they had become, weren't just predators now. They were something more. And they weren't going to let them leave without a fight. The building shook again, a deep, bone-rattling tremor that sent dust cascading from the ceiling. Elena's heart pounded in her chest as she gripped the radio, her knuckles white. Jonas locked eyes with her, and in that moment, they both knew they couldn't stay here. Whatever was outside wasn't going to stop until it got in. The man near the window flinched at another loud thud, stepping back into the shadows as if trying to disappear. "We have to move," Elena whispered, her voice tight with urgency. "There's got to be another way out." Jonas scanned the dark room, his breathing quick and shallow. "Through the back," he said, pointing to a rusted metal door half hidden behind a stack of old equipment. He grabbed Elena's arm, pulling her toward it. The man hesitated for a moment before following, his face twisted in fear. Elena pushed against the door, and it creaked open with a groan that seemed impossibly loud. Beyond it, the jungle stretched into darkness, thick with tangled vines and towering trees. They slipped outside, the cool night air heavy with the scent of damp earth and salt. Jonas pulled the door shut behind them, his hands trembling. They moved quickly, sticking close together, the only sounds their hurried footsteps crunching on leaves and their ragged breathing. The jungle felt different now. Watching, waiting. Elena felt the weight of unseen eyes on them, and every rustling leaf sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. After a few minutes, they slowed, hiding behind a fallen tree to catch their breath. The distant sound of crashing waves filled the night, but something else lurked beneath it, a low, rhythmic clicking, like the sound of teeth snapping together. Jonas wiped sweat from his brow, his eyes darting around the darkened jungle. "We're not alone," he murmured. Elena was about to respond when a sudden noise from the treetops made her look up. A shadow moved, sleek and fast, disappearing just as quickly. Her stomach clenched. "It's not just in the water anymore," she whispered. The man nodded grimly, his voice barely audible. "They've adapted." Elena's mind raced. Whatever experiments had been done here, they hadn't just made the sharks smarter. They had turned them into something else, something that could hunt on land. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stay focused. "We need to reach higher ground," she said. "If we can get a better signal, maybe we can call for help again." Jonas nodded, and they pressed forward, climbing up the rocky incline that led toward the cliffs. Every step felt like a risk, and Elena's muscles ached with the strain. They moved in silence, their eyes scanning the jungle for any sign of movement. But the clicking sound followed them, growing louder, more deliberate. Suddenly, Jonas froze, his eyes wide. "Wait," he hissed. Elena followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. There, just ahead, half hidden in the undergrowth, was a body. A man, his clothes torn, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. Deep, jagged wounds covered his torso, bite marks, but not the kind she'd expect from a shark. Elena swallowed hard. "We're in serious trouble," she whispered. The man with them stepped closer, his face pale. This wasn't here before," he said shakily. Jonas glanced around, his grip tightening on his knife. "We need to keep moving. Now." They pressed on, climbing higher, the air growing colder. Elena's pulse raced as she spotted the silhouette of an old radio tower jutting from the top of the cliff. Relief flooded through her for a brief moment. If they could just get up there, they might have a chance. But then the ground beneath them shifted. A sudden, wet crunch filled the air, and the earth gave way. Elena barely had time to react before she was sliding, the ground crumbling beneath her feet. She hit the rocky slope hard, tumbling down into the darkness below. She landed with a grunt, pain flaring through her shoulder. Above her, Jonas called her name, but before she could answer, she heard it, movement. Slow, deliberate, and far too close. Elena forced herself up, her eyes darting around. The jungle pressed in on all sides, and the clicking sound was louder now, almost deafening. A shape emerged from the shadows, and Elena's breath caught in her throat. It was unlike anything she had ever seen before, a twisted fusion of shark and something else, its sleek, muscular body moving with terrifying grace. Its dark eyes locked onto her, and for a moment, she could swear it was thinking, calculating. She stumbled back, her foot catching on a root. Jonas slid down the slope after her, his face pale with fear. "Elena, run!" She didn't need to be told twice. They sprinted through the undergrowth, the creature moving effortlessly behind them. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, and the jungle seemed to close in tighter with every step. Elena's lungs burned, her legs screaming in protest, but she pushed forward. Just as they reached a break in the trees, the man leading them let out a strangled cry. Elena turned just in time to see something pull him back into the darkness, his scream cut short. Jonas grabbed her wrist, yanking her forward. "Don't stop!" They burst onto the edge of the cliff, the old radio tower looming overhead. Elena's heart pounded as she scanned the area. The clicking sound was gone, but she knew they weren't safe yet. Jonas turned to her, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "What now?" Elena swallowed, staring at the rusted tower. It was their last hope. "We climb." Jonas hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at the darkness behind them. "If we don't make that call..." Elena cut him off. "Then we're dead." Without another word, they scrambled toward the base of the tower, their hands shaking as they grabbed onto the cold metal. Elena didn't look down. She didn't think about what was waiting below. She just climbed, one rung at a time, the wind whipping against her face. As they neared the top, Elena reached for the small control panel attached to the tower, her fingers trembling as she flicked the switch. Static filled the air again, and she spoke into the radio, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her. "This is Captain Marlowe. We need immediate extraction. They're everywhere." A crackle, then silence. Elena's heart sank. Then, a voice, clearer this time. "Hold your position. Help is on the way." Relief flooded through her, but before she could respond, she heard it again. That low, rhythmic clicking, now impossibly close. Jonas' eyes widened in terror as he pointed below. Elena looked down and felt her stomach twist. Shapes moved in the darkness, circling the base of the tower, waiting. And this time, they weren't alone. Elena clung to the tower, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she stared down at the nightmare below. The creatures circled the base, their sleek forms shifting in and out of the shadows. Their dark eyes reflected the moonlight, unblinking and filled with an eerie intelligence. Jonas gripped the metal rungs beside her, his face pale, his knuckles white. "They're waiting," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. Elena's mind raced. Help was on the way, but would it get here in time? The radio crackled again, and a distorted voice cut through the static. "ETA. 10 minutes. Hold position." 10 minutes. It might as well have been an eternity. She scanned the horizon, desperately searching for any sign of their rescue, but all she saw was the endless, dark ocean stretching beyond the cliffs. Jonas shifted beside her. "We can't stay up here forever," he said, his voice tense. "If they climb." Elena swallowed hard, glancing down at the creatures below. They weren't just waiting. They were learning. She could see it in the way they moved, testing their surroundings, nudging the base of the tower with their powerful bodies. One of them lunged upward, its claws scraping against the rusted metal, missing Jonas' foot by inches. He jerked back, his breath hitching. "We're sitting ducks," he muttered. Elena's thoughts raced. She needed to buy them time. Her hand moved to the flare gun strapped to her belt. "We have to distract them," she said, her voice firm. "Give the rescue team a chance to get here." Jonas gave her a wary look but nodded. "Do it." Elena took a deep breath, aimed the flare gun, and fired. The flare shot into the air with a hiss, painting the night sky in a bright red glow. The creatures below recoiled, their eyes following the arc of the light. For a moment, they hesitated, and then, as if on cue, they all turned in unison and bolted toward the flare's landing spot deeper into the jungle. Jonas exhaled sharply. That worked for now. Elena didn't waste the moment. "Let's get higher," she said, pulling herself up the tower. The wind grew stronger the higher they climbed, rattling the old structure. The metal groaned under their weight, but they kept going until they reached the highest platform. From up here, Elena could see the entire coastline, and then, finally, a flash of light in the distance. A boat. Small, fast, cutting through the waves with purpose. Her heart leaped with hope. She grabbed the radio again. "I see you. We're on the radio tower, northeast cliff." The voice crackled through the speaker. "Copy that. Hang tight. We're coming in." Relief flooded through her, but before she could celebrate, a chilling sound reached her ears. The clicking. It was back. And it wasn't coming from below. Jonas turned slowly, his face draining of color. Elena followed his gaze, and her heart froze. One of the creatures was clinging to the side of the tower, its powerful limbs wrapped around the structure. Its dark, soulless eyes locked onto hers, and for a terrifying moment, it just stared. Then, with a burst of speed, it lunged. Elena barely managed to throw herself to the side as the creature's claws slashed through the air where she had just been standing. Jonas shouted, grabbing a loose metal rod and swinging it wildly. The creature hissed, recoiling, but it didn't retreat. It was adapting, getting bolder. Elena's mind screamed for a solution. They were out of time. She looked at the rusted bolts holding the tower together, an idea forming in her mind. It was risky, probably suicide, but it was their only shot. "Jonas," she gasped, pointing at the base of the platform. "We need to bring this thing down." Jonas blinked. "Are you crazy? We'll fall with it." Elena's hands were already moving, wrenching at the bolts with everything she had. "It's the only way to take it out. The boat's almost here. We jump before it hits the ground." Jonas hesitated for half a second, then nodded. Together, they worked frantically, loosening the old bolts, the structure groaning under their weight. The creature lunged again, and this time Jonas swung hard, knocking it back just enough. The platform shuddered violently, the metal screaming as it gave way. "Now!" Elena shouted. They leaped. The tower collapsed behind them with a deafening crash, and the creature let out a shriek as it was buried beneath the twisted wreckage. Elena hit the ground hard, pain jolting through her, but she forced herself up, stumbling toward the edge of the cliff. Below, the rescue boat was there, spotlights cutting through the darkness. Jonas helped her to her feet, and without a second thought, they jumped, plunging into the freezing ocean. The shock stole Elena's breath, but strong hands pulled her onto the deck within seconds. The boat roared to life, speeding away from the island. Elena coughed, shivering, her eyes fixed on the receding shoreline. The jungle was eerily silent now, but she knew better. It wasn't over. Jonas sat beside her, shaking his head in disbelief. "We made it." Elena's expression remained grim. "For now." The crew on the boat scrambled around them, checking their injuries, but Elena's gaze remained locked on the island. And that's when she saw it. One last silhouette standing at the edge of the cliffs, watching them. It was learning. It wasn't over. And deep down, Elena knew. It never would be. As the boat sped away from the island, the cold salt water stinging her skin, Elena couldn't shake the image of the creature standing at the cliff's edge. Its dark eyes, fixed on her, sent a shiver down her spine. She wiped her wet hair from her face, trying to shake the lingering dread, but the sight stayed with her. She glanced at Jonas, who was still staring back at the island, his face drawn with exhaustion. He seemed just as haunted as she felt. "We made it," Jonas muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Elena didn't respond right away. She couldn't. The truth was, the terror they'd faced on that island was far from over. She had the sinking feeling that whatever had been unleashed, there wasn't something that could be contained so easily. The creatures, those hybrid shark-like monsters, were too intelligent, too resourceful. If they survived on the island, they would adapt. As they neared the shore, a heavy silence hung in the air. The crew on the boat was busy, but no one spoke. They all knew what had happened on the island, what they had just barely escaped from. They knew, deep down, that what they had witnessed wasn't just a freak accident. It was the result of something far more sinister. An experiment gone wrong, or perhaps something far worse. When they reached the safety of the mainland, Elena felt a rush of relief mixed with dread. The boat's engine sputtered to a stop, and the crew began unloading equipment. A few of the team members rushed over to check on them, but Elena barely noticed. Her mind was still focused on the island, on the twisted creatures that had stalked them, and on the terrifying implications of what they had just uncovered. "Elena," Jonas, one of the rescue team members, called out, snapping her from her thoughts. "We need your statements, now. We'll get you somewhere safe and take care of everything, but we need to know exactly what happened out there." Elena nodded absently, too exhausted to protest. She followed the crew member to a makeshift briefing station, her feet dragging. The ordeal was finally over. At least, she thought so. But as she sat down and began recounting their harrowing experience, a nagging feeling grew stronger in the pit of her stomach. She couldn't get rid of the feeling that the true story, the full extent of what had happened on that island, was still far from being understood. As she spoke, the words flowing mechanically, she remembered the wrecked research facility, the strange tanks, the eerie silence, and most of all, the way the creatures seemed so purpose-driven. They weren't simply animalistic. They were tactical. They were learning. And that wasn't something she could ignore. Jonas sat beside her, his face a mask of exhaustion and disbelief, his eyes shadowed by the trauma of what they'd witnessed. He looked at her for a moment, then turned away, as if even the memory of it was too much to bear. Once the debriefing ended, Elena found herself standing alone on the dock, staring out at the dark horizon. The calm sea stretched out before her, so serene and still, yet it felt like a facade. What they had left behind on the island had been much darker than any storm or ocean. Whatever research had been conducted there, whatever experiment had started this nightmare, had only just begun to show its true effects. She couldn't help but wonder, how many more islands like that existed? How many more experiments, more creatures were out there? Elena closed her eyes, her breath steadying as she tried to focus. The ocean before her seemed endless, but her mind kept pulling her back to that image. The one of the creature, standing on the cliff, watching them escape. "Do you think it's really over?" Jonah's voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to find him standing beside her. His eyes were filled with the same unease. Elena sighed, feeling the weight of their shared ordeal. "I don't know." There was a long pause, the sound of the ocean filling the space between them. Then, Jonas spoke again. "Whatever it was, it's still out there, isn't it? On the island, watching us." Elena didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. They both knew the truth. The creatures weren't finished yet. But that didn't mean they had to give up. Not yet. "We can't stop it," she said finally, her voice steady. "But we can try to understand it. We have to figure out what happened, before it happens again." Jonas nodded, though his expression remained grim. "We can't let it spread." Elena looked out at the dark water one last time. A cold breeze swept across the dock, tugging at her hair. The world felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting. But she had a feeling the danger wasn't over. It was only just beginning. As the boat engines roared to life and the horizon swallowed the last of the island's silhouette, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that there was much more to this story. Stories of science gone too far, of humanity's mistakes reaching too deep into the unknown. The experiments on the island, the sharks, the creatures, they were just the beginning. She had seen it with her own eyes, and there was no way to ignore it now. "Get ready, Jonas," she murmured, her gaze hardening. "We have a bigger fight ahead of us." Jonas didn't reply, but she could see the determination in his eyes. Together, they would face whatever came next, whatever horrors had been unleashed from the depths of the ocean. But this time, they wouldn't be caught off guard. They would be ready. As the boat sliced through the water, taking them further from the nightmare they had just escaped, Elena's thoughts drifted back to the moment they'd escaped the island. To that final chilling glimpse of the creatures still standing on the cliffs, watching them leave. And in that moment, she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of a much larger story, a story that would stretch far beyond the island, and into the very heart of humanity's darkest fears. The ocean was vast, and so were the unknowns lurking beneath it.